First of all, thank you all for being here. Again, my name is Jack Flowers. I'm originally from Indianapolis, Indiana, and found myself in a very unique circumstance when I entered the service and then ended up in Vietnam. I come from a long sort of family of military folks. One of my grandfathers was in the Spanish-American War, believe it or not, and my other grandfather was in World War I. My father was a tail gunner in a B-17 during World War II in Europe, and I had an uncle who was a Marine that fought on Iwo Jima. This is a picture of my father and myself, which I'm very proud of. It's called Captain's Flowers. We both ended up being captains in our career. What I like to do is read the foreword of my book, which is more or less a prologue. It's not that long, but it sort of reflects what was going on back in 1969, and as importantly, what was going on with me. By Moon Day, July 20th, 1969, I was RAT 6, leader of the 1st Infantry Division Tonnerets, and had been for almost 5 months. My team and I were on a mission in the Iron Triangle. We were supporting an infantry company and came under fire near a rice paddy. Several of the riflemen were wounded, and when they were medevac, word came down that Neil Armstrong had landed on the moon. That excitement spread through the lines at the news. That night, we remained with the infantry as we were pinned down by the Viet Cong. Soaked to the bone, we slept little as the mosquitoes buzzed and bit. But there was a beautiful full moon despite it all. I remember cursing the whole war, wondering, who in the hell is Neil Armstrong? Why is he on the moon and I'm stuck in a rice paddy in Vietnam? I made a vow. If I indeed survived this war, I was going to change my life. I was going to go back to school, get my degree in engineering from Rose Poly, where my father always wanted me to graduate, stop drinking, quit smoking, and not fall in love with the first round-eyed girl I met when I got home. A few months later, I had returned from the war. I re-entered Rose on the morning. I re-enrolled at Rose. On the morning of November 12th, I woke up hungover and staggered to the living room where we had an old black and white television turned on. A fuzzy image on the screen showed the second moon landing. This time it was Pete Conrad. I thought back to that night in the rice paddy where I had vowed to change my life. I hadn't. Here I was flunking out of school again, drinking and smoking, playing a lot of cards, rarely attending class, and was engaged to a girl I had known for less than a month. I quit school the next day, broke off the engagement, and fled to Denmark, where I had lived and went to school 4 years before. Then I had fallen in love with a wonderful young woman named Lona, who was opposed to our involvement in Vietnam, as most Danes did. When I arrived in Copenhagen, I was received with open arms by Lona and Ilse, her mother. I intended to stay. Shortly thereafter, at Ilse's apartment, something very bad happened. I always slept on a fold-out cot in her living room. One morning, she woke me to say that she was going to be late coming home from work that evening. I had never slept very well since returning from Vietnam. That morning, when she rustled me, I panicked, and I grabbed her by the throat. She screamed, and so did I. It only took a second for me to realize what I had done. It scared her terribly, but it scared me even more. In a cold sweat, I apologized profusely as she tried to comfort me. Something was very wrong with me. The horrors of the war still dominated in my mind. The next day, I started writing Rat 6. It took me 5 years to finish the book. It was my way to get it all out of my system, a catharsis, a cleansing of the soul. It's a story I have wanted to tell for the last 40 years. Although Rat 6 is a novelization of my year in Vietnam, it is based on actual events, how I felt about the conflict on the ground and under the ground in the tunnels, as well as the conflict in my mind. The book is 20 chapters long, and what I want to do is just now go through each chapter and give a very brief summary of what it's all about. Chapter 1, Copenhagen. As I mentioned in the prologue, I had gone to school in Denmark, and when I was stationed at Fort Knox, Kentucky, I happened to run into a fellow who I actually had been in with the Scandinavian Seminar in Denmark. He was in Norway while I was in Denmark, and we hadn't seen each other since 1965 or 66 or so, and we immediately had a beer and got to know each other all over again. He was an officer, and as well as I. So we decided to take leave together. Back in those days, you always got your orders for Vietnam about 6 months prior to being shipped out. And I had already been at Fort Knox for about 8 or 9 months. And therefore, the time for me to actually get my orders for Vietnam was running very short. And we all thought, well, maybe we weren't going to go. Maybe we would stay where we were or be assigned someplace else. So Mike and I decided to go off back to Europe, and we left for Copenhagen. When I got to Copenhagen, we traveled in uniform, and I had to sign in with the American Embassy to let them know where I was and how I could be contacted. While I was there, I got to visit some old schoolmates, my old girlfriend, her mother, and a lot of other friends. And on a trip to one of the islands in Denmark, I got a phone call, or at least a phone message was relayed to me, that the embassy had called and they wanted to talk to me immediately. So I scurried back to Copenhagen and showed up at the embassy. And there was a telegram for me. It was from Major Duffer, the executive officer of where I was stationed as the information officer of the armor school. It basically said, you've got orders for Vietnam, suggest you return as soon as possible. So I did. Chapter 2 is called Avis. Before I'd left for Vietnam, they were starting to do some reconstruction on our offices. And the colonels, secretaries, and other female staff, civilian staff, would meet in a little coffee room, which happened to be right behind my office. So I get to hear all of the buzz and all of the rumors that were going on. And there had been a tragedy while I was gone. One of the secretaries, her name was Avis. Her actual name was Carol King, but in the book she's called Avis. Avis's husband had been killed in an automobile accident shortly after he had returned from Vietnam. Bereaved, Avis left, and no one ever thought she would come back to work, but she did. And when she came back, she happened to stop at my desk one day, as everybody had been informed that I was also on my way to Vietnam. And she wished me good luck. And I decided I was going to take her out. So I asked her to go out on a date, and she did. To say the least, that date ended up in one of the oldest stories in Hollywood. Boy meets girl, soldier meets girl. Right before he shipped off to war, they promised to write and meet again. And that's what happened with Avis and I. Chapter 3 is entitled Off to War. Chapter 3 basically describes what happened next, and that was getting orders, getting shipped out, going to Oakland, California, getting on an airplane and flying off to Vietnam. I met up with a lot of old classmates because it seemed as if we all had gotten orders late and we were all sort of on the same airplane or thereabouts going off to Vietnam. What struck me so remarkably was that as we left, the airplane was full. It was a TWA flight, and there was nothing but a lot of noise, a lot of rah-rah. And this had been playing craps in the back. Everyone's anxious, very, very excited about going off into this place called Vietnam. And I always thought, I'm not that excited about it. Why is the rest of them? But they were. So when I arrived in Vietnam, chapter 4 is called Die Hard. Die Hard was the code name for the 1st Infantry Division's 1st Engineer Battalion. That was the name of the battalion. And I was being assigned to a company in that battalion. So chapter 4 describes how I became a platoon leader with the Charlie Company of the 1st Engineer Battalion. Chapter 5 describes Charlie Company and what my responsibilities were as a 2nd lieutenant platoon leader. They were most often certainly not combat, but we did a lot of mine sweeping, a lot of fire defense positions, fire support bases, doing a lot of road work, and every once in a while doing some bridge repair. So chapter 5 describes all of the various duties that I performed as a 2nd lieutenant. Chapter 6 is REMFs. While I was the platoon leader, we were working on a place called Thunder 1. And Thunder 1 was a night defensive position that housed infantry and also artillery. And the artillery battery that was there, I became very close friends with Lieutenant Randy Gold. He was a fire support officer. And we were talking one night having a beer, and he said, we're all just REMFs supporting the infantry. And I said, well, what's a REMF? And he said, Flowers, you're so young, you don't know anything. A REMF is, pardon my language, ma'am, a rear echelon mother, and you can put the last word in. A REMF was someone, as we all were, soldiers that were in support of the infantry. We were all in support of the infantry. So Randy Gold taught me what a REMF was, and indeed we all were. Chapter 7 is entitled Tunnels. Along the way, my platoon happened to get a reputation of being out in combat, in support of units that were in maybe a firefight or something that were on the front lines. And one of our duties was to support some group called the Tunnel Rats. The Tunnel Rats were an elite group of soldiers that were assigned to the battalion, organized, and their job was to go out and go through tunnels when they were found out in the field. The primary mission was to evacuate any intelligence that might be there and destroy the tunnels as much as they could. They all carried about 50 pounds of explosives, but when the tunnels were too big, they needed help. So an engineer platoon like mine, we were brought in to help with the detonation and getting more demolitions into the tunnels. Chapter 8 is called Insubordinate. I was rather cocky young lieutenant, and sometimes I didn't always obey orders, especially when they did not come from my own internal chain of command. Chapter 8 describes how I got into some trouble with a couple of captains out in the field. And I was almost court-martialed for it, as a matter of fact. Chapter 6 is entitled, excuse me, that was 8. So chapter 9 is entitled Rat 6. During that time that I was out supporting the Tunnel Rats, I came to find out that the leader of the Tunnel Rats was called Rat 6. That was his code name. That's the code. That's the name of the book. Rat 6 had a sergeant, and that sergeant was Rat 5. Well, it was really a sergeant that usually runs the whole army anyway. And this particular soldier had been present at the creation of the Tunnel Rats, and his nickname was Batman. His real name was Sergeant Robert Batten. In the book, he's called Robert Bateman. Chapter 10 is entitled Batman, and it describes my encounters with Batman before I actually became Rat 6. Batman was a no-nonsense staff sergeant from New Jersey, and he had been there on 3 tours already. He'd never been promoted. He'd also been wounded 4 times with 3 Purple Hearts and a soldier's medal. He was a very brave man. And he also trained and had very high discipline with his Tunnel Rats. So chapter 10 talks about how I encountered Batman for the first time. Chapter 11 is called Black Horse. Let me go back to chapter 10. Someplace along the line, the previous Rat 6 was being transferred. He was going home. So they needed a new Rat 6. And since I had had a lot of experience with the Tunnel Rats, I was called in to the battalion commander's office and was asked if I would volunteer to become the next Rat 6. And I didn't want to, but as a good officer, yes, sir. Chapter 11 is called Black Horse. Black Horse was the code name for the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment, commanded by none other than Colonel George Patton III, George Patton Jr.'s son. As his father, like son, he was very flamboyant with the pistol-handled revolvers, and they called him Crazy George. Well, Crazy George loved to have the Tunnel Rats because he, as his unit, did not really have any infantry. He had what was called armored personnel carriers and tanks. Armored personnel carriers and tanks. So if you ever got a chance to have a half a dozen or a dozen more soldiers like the Tunnel Rats, he loved having us around. And they used us often. Chapter 12 is called Missions. I was on 97 missions over my tour as the head of the Tunnel Rats. Most of the missions were cold, but some were hot. And you can imagine the difference. But you always had to assume that the missions were going to be hot. You always had to assume that someone was inside those tunnels. As you were going after them, they were going after you. So chapter 12 gives a description of some of the missions, the various missions that I was on. Chapter 13 is called Tokyo. One of my other responsibilities, other than being the head of the tunnel rats and a reconnaissance officer, I was also the battalion historian. So therefore, I got to see all of the activities of all of the units inside of the division, as well as mostly inside of the battalion. Everyone had to make out what was called an after-action report after every mission, many of which I had authored myself. And every year, the battalion tried to put together a yearbook, which I ended up having responsibility for. So part of that responsibility was putting everything together and going off to Tokyo to deal with the Nippon press and get the yearbook. It was really supposed to be an R&R for me. While I was there, I also visited a couple of wounded men that I had served with, and also, of course, did a few naughty things, as most soldiers did when they were on R&R. Chapter 14 is called Batman's Curse. When I came back from Tokyo, I was told Batman had not been given permission to serve his 4th term. They were going to send him home. He'd had enough, in their opinion. He didn't want to. Batman was was a very well-known soldier in Vietnam. He was on the Viet Cong's 10 most wanted list. They didn't have his name, but they had his nickname. Everyone knew who Batman was. And that 10 most wanted list included people like Westmoreland and other commanding officers around the whole area of operation. So when Batman told me, or I was told that he was not going to return, we went out and had a few drinks one night right before we left, and he told me, he said, "Six, you're one of the best sixes I ever had, but you're not tough enough." And I said, "What are you talking about?" I'd already been wounded a couple of times. He and I had been hand in hand, going through tunnels, saved each other's lives. And he said, "You're just not mean enough. You don't know how to kill them." And I said, "I think we did enough of them. We've done enough killing, although I'd never really seen if we'd killed anybody." And he said, "Well, they're either going to take you out head first or feet first. And I predict you're going to come out feet first. You're just not tough enough. Either you're going to get yourself or the enemy's going to get you." Chapter 14, that was Batman's curse. Chapter 15 is called Close Calls. After Batman left, I found myself to being much more in charge, having to go point more often, how to train the men, and not trusting anybody.
Not trusting what?
Not trusting any of the soldiers, because I always trusted Batman. He was going to get us through some very hazardous times. So I was always afraid you do not want to lose any of your men. Early on, when I was asked to take over the tunnel rats, I asked the executive officer of the battalion, I said, "Have we ever lost any tunnel rats? Have any of them ever been killed?" And he said, "No." They're very proud of that. But they've all been wounded at least once. Well, I'd gotten my couple of wounds too. So chapter 15 describes many of the close calls that we had. as a unit after Batman left. Chapter 16 is called Poncho. Along the way, we did, however, recruit into our unit a young man by the name of Joe Gonzalez. In the book, his name is Poncho. Joe turned out to be a very reliable, good tunnel rat. He was a Mexican-American from Texas, and he was just as good as, and trained as good as anybody. We also got a new sergeant. His name was Sergeant Schultz. And Poncho and Sergeant Schultz became my two right hands. Well, Poncho ended up in a very bad position one day. We were out on a mission, and we had been engaged by a Viet Cong unit. And this was the only real firefight I ever got into with my unit. We were with an armored unit, and we were sitting on top of tanks, and all of a sudden we were ambushed. Well, we immediately responded with fire. The 50 caliber machine guns and M60 machine guns were raking everything in front of us. I carried an M16, Poncho carried an M79 grenade launcher. All of this happened within 8 to 10 minutes, and the firefight was over. But at the end, near the end, Poncho fired his grenade launcher into a little cluster of men, and he blew half of them up. And as we were sweeping through after the firing stopped, Poncho saw what he had done, what he had been responsible for, and he sort of went nuts. My sergeant had to take a hold of him, and as a matter of fact, he had to hit him and knock him out. We didn't want anybody to see any cowardice, and certainly wasn't cowardice, but it was just that it got to him. So Poncho was taken out by helicopter later that day. And I was very distraught myself. So when I got back after the next day or two from that mission, I went to the executive officer and said, you know, Major, I don't think I can do this anymore. I want to quit. He immediately asked the S1, Captain Nelson, who's going on R tomorrow? And someone barked back, a couple of sergeants and an officer. We'll replace the officer with Flowers. He's leaving. And I said, I've already had my R&R. Well, you're going on another one. So the next day I was off to another R&R. But this time it was to the Philippines.
It was what?
To the Philippines. Chapter 17 is entitled Clark. Clark was Clark Air Force Base outside of Manila. It was the largest Air Force base we had in the Pacific at the time. When I got there, I immediately felt guilty. I left my men. And then I remembered someone was at Clark I knew. I knew her very well. Avis from Fort Knox had transferred to Clark Air Force Base as a civilian and was working there. So when I got in, I called the post locator and asked for Avis Jet. And they put me through to her. I couldn't believe it. So we immediately got together, had dinner that night, and sort of tried to fall back in love all over again. But she recognized that something was much different with me, much different. Chapter 18 is called Short. When I returned from that second R&R, I went immediately to the XO and I said, I'm sorry, sir, where are my men? He says, well, they're out in a mission. He said, I should have never left them. Are they all right? I said, yes. Well, then you better go meet them when they come in. He knew in the back of his mind that was going to happen to me. So he sort of played me, and yes, indeed, I was ready to come back to my men. Chapter 18 is entitled Short. Short is an expression which means your tour duty is getting short. That means short in time. And I was less than 6 weeks before I was supposed to go home. Well, they made me all kinds of offers to stay for another 6 months. Promotion to captain, go back to college, go to engineering schools in the Army. And I was hesitant about it all because I knew I was getting short. Well, they really needed time to find my replacement, which they weren't doing a very good job. You got to remember, we were all volunteers, and you had to be a special type of soldier to be a tunnel rat. They used to say about us, we were long on balls and very short on brains. And that sort of described most of my men and myself. Chapter 19 is titled 6 Shots. There are all kinds of standard operating procedures as far as going through the tunnels are concerned, but one rule that we held sacred: you never fired your weapon more than 3 times. You always reloaded. You may be recon by fire when you're going around a tunnel or up and down a different tier inside of a tunnel, and you recon by fire. That means you fire into empty space, into the dark, just to make sure that nobody was around the corner or right in front of you. So chapter 19 is somewhat the climax of the book. We were out on a mission. Again, I was very short. And we came across, again, it was with an infantry unit, and we came across, we could see in the distance, there was a group of bunkers that looked like they were being built. And we could see Viet Cong or NVA scurrying around. Must have been a dozen, maybe 18, maybe 20 of them. And of course, we advanced on their position, got some fire, returned fire, but when we got close enough and we had raked the place with reconnaissance fire, we looked around and there were 6 tunnels, or 6 entrances to tunnels. And we knew that they were there because we'd seen them go into them from afar, of course. Well, my men and I, we sort of decided to split them up. One man would take one at a time. So one of the rats would go head first or be at point and go and explore the tunnel to see how big it was, or if it was big at all, or how much we were going to have to use for demolitions, whatever we did. This was procedure. Well, we got through 5 of them, and there was only one left. And we all looked around, who's going to go down that one? Well, I was the only one that hadn't gone down yet, because I was short. And then I said, I'll do it. And then my sergeant said, no, sir, one of us will do it. I said, no, it's my turn. So it happened to be that looked like a well that went straight down. And you could see at the bottom of the well, or the bottom of the hole, that it was curved and it was going into a tunnel. Well, this was common procedure for us as well. I was hooked up with what was called a Swiss seat with ropes, and they were going to lower me into that tunnel, sort of that well hole. And as I was being lifted down, my whole life appeared to me in seconds. It only took about 15 or 20 seconds to lower me down, but that lasted in my mind for like hours. I remembered everything from my youth, from the draft board, to my girlfriends, to my time in Europe. And it was all just things in my mind. But when I get close to the bottom, again, this was standard practice, I would give a signal and they would drop me down. So the last foot and a half or so, that I would hopefully surprise whoever might be at the other end. So when I got down there, I realized there had to be people here. And I realized they were going to shoot me. I knew it because where were they? Well, again, we've been trained when you're dropped into a hole in a situation like that, you take your arm, you hold it up to your temple, you crouch your head, you have your pistol ready, and when you are given the word and you are dropped, you start firing. And that's what happened. But I knew he was on full automatic with an AK-47. He would cut me in half. So my only chance was to get him before he pulled the trigger. They dropped me down, and I saw him. He was only 2 or 3 feet away, right in front of me. And I started firing. Well, first shot got him here, second shot got him here, third, fourth, fifth, and the sixth. It was a perfect shot group. He hadn't killed me, but I kept pulling the trigger. Click, 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 click. I looked up and my men knew that I had killed somebody, otherwise I wouldn't have fired more than 3 times. And they knew that it was a close call, but I'd done it. And then I looked back inside of the tunnel and I saw that shot group in this man's face. But it wasn't his face at all. It was a wall of mud. It was a perfect shot group, but there was no one there at all. Nothing. Somehow the enemy had escaped. Somehow there was no one there. Somehow in my mind there was. And my men knew that I killed somebody. So the sergeant yelled down, "Should I drop you another pistol, sir?" And I said, "No." So they brought me back up and someone else went down and I realized he's gone bonkers. He's crazy. He didn't do anything. They got me out of there right away. And when I got back, my sergeant went to the executive officer and said, "Sir, Lieutenant Flowers has had it. We got to replace him." And he explained what had happened. So Major Lawrence, who was his name, said, "Yeah, we'll get rid of him today." I think it was the next day. Chapter 20 is called Getting Out. So the next day, the major wanted to see me, said, "Flowers, you're finished. You're getting out of here." I had about 8 days or 9 days left in my tour. They should have gotten rid of me a long time ago, or at least put me on the rear lines and get me out of there. So they drew up orders for me to get out like the next day, which was pretty fast for the Army. And they got me out. Well, I also had gained somewhat of a reputation because of what I was. Rat 6 was a very big deal in Vietnam. Batman was a big deal. So a lot of people knew who I was. I was told that I was also on the 10 most wanted list. Not my name, just Rat 6. So they got me out. And when I got to the different stations along the way, I was always given a little bit of harassment by an enlisted man because "You're not supposed to be here yet, sir. You're not supposed to be here till next Tuesday." And then some officer in the background, "Who is it?" "Well, it's Lieutenant Flowers." "Well, in the book, my name is Lieutenant Price." And so I would go in and talk to him. "Yeah, we'll get you out of here, Price. We'll get you out of here as soon as we can." And indeed they did. They got me out within about 4 days. The next thing I knew, I was on an airplane, another TWA flight, back to the States. But it was a different flight. It was a different feeling. There was no noise. It was totally quiet. There wasn't any craps being played. There wasn't any joyous bravado. Everybody wanted to just get home. But I remembered the flight going over, how exciting it was. But the flight going back was exciting, but only to each individual. Anyway, we landed. I called my parents. Well, the last little harassment I got was enlisted men. Some sergeant said, "Sir, you're not even supposed to be here for another 6 days." I said, "What are you going to do, send me back?" And of course they didn't. So they sent me home. When I got home, I was in full uniform. I had been awarded 3 Bronze Stars, 2 for valor, 1 Army Commendation Medal for valor, 1 Purple Heart, although I should have had 2 or 3, and an Air Medal. So when I got there, my father, who was sort of in the background, my mother was there and my sisters, and everybody was in tears and wishing me well and wishing me a good home. And my father looked at my uniform and said, "Son, how did you get that Air Medal?" Of course, he knew exactly what an Air Medal was because he was an aviator. He was a tail gunner on a B-17. So he knew exactly, and his uniform had Air Medals on it too. So I explained to him that because I was in the air a lot, not only just on reconnaissance, for example, going up and down the various roads looking for landmines, but every time we went out on a mission, we had to log how much time we'd spent in the air. And I'd spent a lot, so I'd gotten 2 Air Medals. So I never will forget how he had recognized that. And the last paragraph of the book is something that I always feel that the last couple of paragraphs. When I got home, I sat there patiently waiting. A whole new life was about to unfold for me. My destiny had been fulfilled. It had been my turn to fight. Scared but alive, I had returned from my war. Now I would have to try to forget it all. It had to have been a mistake. I knew it then, but there was nothing I could do now. That would be left to historians, politicians, and the press. Maybe someday they would all wake up. That was why the plane had been so quiet. We all knew. Maybe someday somebody would ask us about it someday, and maybe we would be listened to. Rat 6 was dead. He died in some tunnel someplace in the Iron Triangle. I couldn't remember just when it happened, but I knew he was dead. Hopefully I thought if I ever had a son, he would never have to revive him. And that's the end of the book. So I'd be more than happy to answer any questions you might have.
Could you clarify that last chapter? Rat 6 is dead, etc. Does that mean you were really questioning the whole enterprise at that point?
I had always questioned the whole enterprise, basically from my time when I was in Europe. And I was a student of the history of the war, the whole domino theory thing. And before I left, I'd read a lot about the war, and certainly after I returned home, I read everything I could read about the war over these many years. I'd become very well known. Books were written about me. There was a book called The Tunnels of Ku Chi that was written by a couple of Englishmen. They found me when I was working as a stockbroker for Merrill Lynch in Philadelphia. And when they found me, they were writing a whole history of the tunnel warfare. But when they found me, they'd found a plethora of information, because I had all of that recollection of those after-action reports from being the historian. When I started Rat 6, I also had copies of the battalion history. So I never kept a diary, but I had a great memory because I was reminded everything from what units I'd been with to the various map coordinates where I was. So yes, I was fundamentally against the war, but I was for my men, for the soldiers. My men were particularly brave. Nothing like them. Hope that answers your question.
It starts to, yes. And yet, even though you were against the war, you stepped forward to be inducted and went.
Well, again, family heritage.
Pardon?
My family heritage.
Yes. Yes.
I always thought my two grandfathers fought, my father and uncle fought. It was my turn to fight. You have to remember back then, we were afraid. I mean, the whole country was afraid. Communism, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Southeast Asia. They were going to walk their way down to Australia, and the next thing would be San Francisco. What bunk! It was not true at all. So yes, I think it was I don't necessarily call a call to duty, but that was what I was born and raised with.
Sure.
Yes, ma'am.
Go ahead. You were a battalion asset, and it sounds like you were utilized to destroy the tunnel after they were found, rather than going out and trying to find them.
Yes.
Is that correct then?
Yes.
Okay. How
Colonel-
large were some of these tunnels?
Colonel Patton prided himself in finding them. So he became very, like I said, we became some of his favorite soldiers. As a matter of fact, there's a story that's in the book. My battalion commander called me and he said, "We've got to meet George at the helicopter pad." Well, he meant George Patton. Well, my battalion commander was a lieutenant colonel, as Patton was a full colonel. And rarely did a battalion commander go out, like with me. Never. But if Colonel Patton wanted him to show up, he showed up. So we went to the helicopter pad, got into the helicopter pad. He had a helicopter with radio banks. He could be talking to the Pentagon, because he was in contact with everybody in Vietnam, as well as maybe the Defense Department. So we had headsets on, so we could communicate, with an intercom on board. And we're out maybe 15, 20 minutes in the air, and we land. His two side gunners in the helicopter with their M60 machine guns pop out. George pops out, and I pop out. My colonel stays in the helicopter. And I look around, there's no support. There's no security. We're out in the middle of nowhere with two machine gunners, a helicopter that making a hell of a lot of noise, and Patton and me. He said, "Look down there, you see that? What do you think? That's a hole, isn't it, that tunnel?" Well, I went into it real quick, looked around, yeah, it was. But I didn't want to stay out there without any any security, any support. When can you get in here and do this? Tomorrow or the next day? Will you get out here? And I said, yes, sir, but we're gonna have to have security. Don't worry, you'll have all the tanks you need around here. So we get back into the helicopter, thank God, flew off. We're on the intercom again. And my colonel says to George, George, don't you think that was a little bit risky to be out there with no infantry support, no security? And George on the phone, on the intercom says, Bob, don't you ever forget my last name. And then he repeated, Patton, Patton, Patton. I can remember that as if it were happened yesterday. So yeah, they found them. When they were either too big or didn't know what to do with them, they called us because they knew that we were the experts supposedly to go into them.
What was the biggest one you destroyed?
Actually, over a kilometer long, and it's also described in the book. It took us like a whole day to get it set with C4 charges. What we try to do is just destroy as much of the entrance, and if you could find the exit, as much as you could. We found a lot of intelligence there too. One time we came across the radio. That was big. That was a goal to get a radio, because you maybe could get some of their frequencies and maybe listen in on their communications. Yes, ma'am.
Did you have a family? I mean, did you get married and have a family?
Yes, but very hard.
Can you repeat the question?
Now, she wondered about my life after Vietnam, and it wasn't very nice. I've been married 3 times, 2 divorces, although I have 4 wonderful children. Unfortunately, 2 of my wives have also passed away. But my current wife, we've been married for some 20-some years. We have 2 daughters, and we have a son and a daughter. Both have graduated from college, one in Maine here and the other one from Hofstra University in New York. And they're doing very well. I have 2 other daughters, both graduated, one from the University of North Carolina, Wellington, the other from Villanova, that live in the Philadelphia area. But it was hard. My wife today, I'm signed up with the Veterans Administration, so I get all my primary health care from the Veterans Administration, which is, by the way, it's very, very, very good. And he read the book, and he said to me, he said, Jack, don't you ever have nightmares or anything? Don't you have any PTSD or anything? I said, well, I don't know. I never, back in those days, there wasn't such a thing as PTSD. At least we didn't know much about it. So he said, you know what? You should make a claim against the VA. I said, what do you mean? So he explained to me that I had to have had some trauma. I had to have some PTSD, and indeed I did, and I just wouldn't admit it. But my wife would tell you, he can't sleep. It's called startle response. Don't ever come up from behind me. Not that I'm brave, I'm just always afraid. So anyway, the VA's been very good to me about that.
How do they support someone with PTSD?
Beg your pardon?
How do they support you?
Well, I went through therapy courses. There's some monetary remuneration for how much disability you might have, and I think I took a 12-hour course with a psychiatrist or psychologist, and then which was helpful, and then also being around other veterans who also have similar experiences, but nothing like mine. Although they all had some trauma too. So no, I shouldn't complain.
I don't want to ask too many questions here, but can we go back to chapter 8? And there were times when your obstreperousness or your pride or your questioning about the war, whatever reason, got you into trouble, where you perhaps didn't follow orders, or I don't know.
Well,
I'm
not
curious
really.
about-
I mean, most of my non-following orders was because I was kind of cocky. And I don't like, insubordinate.
Mhm.
They were usually from, well, there's the two main times, or three times. They're too kind of complicated to get, you have to read the book to see with you, but one in particular was that a captain who was new to where we were said he wanted my men's feet inspected.
He wanted them what?
My men's feet inspected.
Feet inspected.
Feet.
Yeah.
To make sure they didn't have rot. All right. You know, an infantryman, you're on the ground. You gotta have good feet. You gotta have good socks. You gotta have boots. And I said to him, I said, "Are you kidding me?" And he outranked me. He was a captain. I said, "No, he didn't expect me to do it." I said, "Go fuck yourself."
Yeah.
Excuse me. And so he turned me in. And there was another time that as a reconnaissance officer, my tunnel rats and I, usually we were airlifted no matter where we went. But this time it was close enough to our base that they took us out in tanks and APCs. And they dropped us off. We were supposed to reconnoiter a bridge site that had been destroyed. It's called an Eiffel Bridge, French. So the lieutenant dropped me off. We walked about 200 meters inland. It was sort of open, it wasn't like jungle, so we found the bridge pretty quickly. It indeed had been destroyed. But there was a major operation plan with Rome plows. These are big, huge bulldozers with big blades to cut down the jungle. So I made an after-action report. I did a reconnaissance report and sent back. Well, a couple of weeks later, they called me up and said, "You get to the division headquarters." Get to division headquarters, and Colonel Archer, I think his name was, said, "Young man, here's your reconnaissance report. When our people got there, the bridge was not destroyed, it was halfway there, halfway destroyed. We had to go in and destroy it and then rebuild it, which took them a day or two, so it made them late in their rendezvous for all of these plows." And he said, "Do you know how much fuel we had to burn up out there?" So they were bound and determined that, somebody had to pay for this. Well, pay means out of your check. Well, it was like $150,000, something like that, which I thought that was very ridiculous. Well, it turns out, then I started making excuses. I said, "Well, look, I went to these coordinates, they dropped me off, and this is what I saw." Well, they took me to the wrong coordinates. It just so happened that there was a river there, of course, that's why there was a bridge. And 1,000 meters later was where the bridge I was supposed to recon. So they dropped me off at the wrong site. I'd walked in, saw it, just assumed that was the one that was on my map, made out the report, and left. Well, I got in a lot of trouble, but the lieutenant that dropped me off got in a lot more. So no, it was incidents like that being insubordinate.
In the aftermath of the war, when you came home, did you become active in the anti-war movement, or did your questions about the war become more strident?
No.
No.
I withdrew.
You withdrew?
Withdrew.
Yeah, from the whole question.
From the whole thing.
Yeah.
It wasn't until later on that, of course, my father wanted me to join the Veterans of Foreign Wars, which he was a member. I went to a meeting and I basically said to him, "I hope you guys are out of business. I don't want to really be part of this, which he understood. And, but over the years, because there have been certain reunions, my book, although it brings back a lot of these memories, and I do have trouble, you know, especially when I do these presentations. I'll have a few beers tonight and come back when I go home. But I mean, I kind of, not necessarily drown your sorrow in liquor, but I sort of find that, you know, calms me down. And my wife always gets, she says, I don't know why you go do these readings. I said, well, I'm trying to sell some books, you know. But no, but I've done a lot of, I've been interviewed a lot of times. Every once in a while, I get a phone call from some editor online. I've been offered 2 movie contracts, neither of which happened. There were options on my life story. I've appeared on 60 Minutes, Good Morning America. Charlie Rose did a big segment about me. So I've not been rich nor famous, but could have been, put it that way. Morley Safer interviewed me along with 5 other tunnel rats. We were also invited to the 1st Infantry Division Museum in Cantigny, Illinois, outside Chicago. There was myself, Joe Gonzalez, who is Pancho in the book, the Rat 6 that was ahead of me, that was one before me, and the Rat 6 that was after me. We all came. And they paid us a stipend to if we got there, they'd pay us some money and put us up in some nice place. So before I left, it was in November, and before I left, I asked, well, what's the weather like? I mean, I'm from Indiana, so Chicago's not good weather in November, so I really didn't dress that well, but I asked the lady, I said, well, how many folks do you think will be there? She said, it all depends on the weather. We have a great museum, a lot of patrons. Usually we get 30 or 40, but you can't guarantee anything. Well, we got there a day early and rehearsed. We all had our little say. The next night, it was almost blizzardous. Rain, sleet, bitterly cold. And I thought, nobody's going to come to this place. They had TV cameras. They were getting ready. Well, we get there. All of a sudden, standing room only. Tunnel rats is a draw. We were such a unique group, right? There were other groups, the Green Berets, the Lurks, the SEALs, you know, other specialized soldiers. But tunnel rats have a very special place. Okay, folks, well, go ahead.
One more. My very best friend in high school went to the Air Force, ended up, after high school, went to the Air Force Academy and flew 310 missions over North Vietnam, survived them all, came back. And a year ago, he said, we got together, we're still, all through that period, we're best friends, even though I was conscientious objector and all this.
Yeah.
And a year ago, we got together and he said, George, Vietnam was a mistake. It was really a mistake. I'd sort of been listening to hear that for 30 or 40 years, but and I'm always amazed at what you do when you're in this machine based on obedience. What you do if you see that, you know, and someone gives you an order and you, in your moral sense or whatever, is saying, no, this killing is not justified.
Yeah. Well, like I said, my heritage was, is it my turn to fight? And it was. But there was no question that I questioned the war. And when I came back, I questioned it even further. And then I also questioned my participation. And my participation, I don't know how many people we were responsible for killing, but we did. You know, when you blow up a tunnel, and there's people inside. It's a horrible death. Smothered, blown up, whatever it is. But we never saw the aftermath, although one time they did dig up Patton again, a small bulldozer to dig up to see what was in there, you know. So that kind of made me sick when I went out. He insisted we go out and see it. But no, and it's taken me, I'm 77 years old. So it took me a long time to write this book, number one. You know, giving presentations like this, you know, do get me, you know, nervous, get me choked up sometimes. And meeting other vets too, that sometimes are in attendance. So, and I'm somewhat involved with some veterans organizations, not as active as my father was, but with the Vet Center, for example, others more recent soldiers, you know, but they all know what a tunnel rat was. Any other questions? I have some books if anyone wants to buy one. The hardcover is $36.95, the softcover is $22.95, and thank you all for coming.
Yeah.